You are entering a realm paved with good intentions. Also, aliens. If we didn't have to go to work, what would we complain to our friends about? Welcome to another episode of Paved with Good Intentions, the show that asks the difficult questions you didn't even think you cared about. I'm Danielle Kessner, and this podcast is produced sponsor-free, so thank you for supporting independent artists. Today we'll be discussing the music industry, but first, here's a piece of random trivia. You know how much I love space. Did you know that a year on Mercury is only 88 days long? I certainly wouldn't want to go there to feel young or fit. Mercury is the second densest planet behind Earth. Lucky us. But what else would you expect from a wrinkled little planet that could be as close as 46 million kilometers from the sun? It also has a sort of atmosphere, which is constantly being blown away by solar winds before being replenished on this constant cycle. But even being so close to the sun, it's not even the hottest planet in our solar system. That would be Venus. What else is new? Of course Venus is hot. And now, on to our episode. Play it again, Sam, but don't pay for it. So, if you're anything like anybody today, you probably are into streaming music, and there's a number of different platforms you could use to stream music. Whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple Music, Pandora, SoundCloud, or even just load up a bunch of videos on YouTube and watch those. There's a lot of different ways that people are consuming music. Radio play is not necessarily the same as it used to be because somebody can just go onto the internet, pick an artist, and just listen to everything they've ever produced. Spotify has over 100 million monthly users. So 100 million unique people are using Spotify every month. YouTube has over 1 billion users, 128 million monthly in the US alone. Every minute, there is 400 hours of video uploaded to YouTube. And then you have other sites like Apple Music, you have Pandora, you have SoundCloud, you have all these other ways, not to mention just the fact that people can get music so much easier by digital means. So we're not consuming music the same way that we used to. It used to be if there was a song you wanted to listen to, you had to wait for it to come on the radio, or you could do what I did and request it and then get a little Walkman and record it as soon as it came on the radio. You could do it that way, which honestly isn't really that much different than stealing music nowadays, but at least back then it was on the radio, which means the artists were actually getting recognition for it. The artists were still getting paid for it. But in the past 20 years, that has kind of changed a little bit with digital media and with the way that we're listening to music, the way we're downloading music and finding it. And anymore, it's not just about how we consume the music, it's about the music itself is becoming a completely different animal. Because anymore, songs are more important than albums. People are more interested in listening to individual songs than they are to listening to a complete work. So when I hear that a band is releasing an album, I get excited, but for a lot of people, it's like, okay, what's the single going to be? Let's play the single. A lot of these artists, all they do is release singles. And when you get an album from them, it's like, okay, but where's the single that you were playing on the radio? And because of this, because people are so much more interested in singles and because of how we consume music, the last decade, the last 15 years have seen a pretty sharp decline in album sales, which is expected with the rise in digital media. You would expect if digital media is much easier and it's comparable cost-wise, then of course people are going to go to digital as opposed to getting a CD, whereas there are people, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody, who actually like physical media, which there's nothing wrong with physical media, but it's becoming harder and harder to sell that when you have so many other options out there to be able to buy it, but not only to be able to buy it, to steal it. I shouldn't say steal it necessarily, but in a way, listening to music for free on some of these sites is actually hurting the artists. Because, in a sense, obviously, an artist, let's say I'm going to make an album. If I need to make an album, I got to be able to subsist for however long it takes to make that album. So let's say it takes a month to record an album. It does not take a month to record an album, but if it did, let's just say it did. I would need Obviously, enough money to cover that month where I am recording the album. I would need the capital for the equipment, not just instruments, but also soundboards, microphones, you know, recording studio time wherever the studio is. So you've got, the overhead that's going to go into making that album. And then you have paying the other people. So it's not just me, it's also the other four, three or four members of the band. We all have to be able to survive on this. And then it's paying anybody else who's involved, the producers, the manager, the sound operators, And then of course there's the artwork, and then there's the publishing, there's the printing, there's the actual making of the physical media. Or if it's not going into physical media, it's getting with the label and creating, the distribution package and all that stuff that's going to go into this. So there is a good amount of money that goes into making an album. It is not just something that they sit down and say, "Hey, let's just do this." There's a lot of work and a lot of money that goes into making an album. So when an album is released, or when a single is released, whatever is released, the idea is that it's put out there in such a way that it will be consumed by people in some way that will produce a return for the artists. I'll get into the Metallica thing in a minute, but the idea is that an artist is creating the music and is hoping that it actually gets consumed in such a way that they make a profit for it. Now, you're probably thinking, well, if it's about the music, then they shouldn't care about the money, right? Which is stupid anyway. I mean, to think that artists don't care about money is ridiculous, because even when somebody like Henry Rollins says, go for, get paid for what you do, and Henry Rollins is not exactly one of those people who's, on the top of the charts. He's, it's Black Flag, for crying out loud. But artists need to be able to recoup the money that they spend to create an album, because basically that's law. I mean, at the point of creating an album, there is no profit there. It is all loss. It is all loss until they start bringing in revenue, which is where album sales, where tickets, not much from ticket sales. Merchandising is really like a big one, but this is where this stuff comes in. So when you watch a video on YouTube that is pirated, nothing is going to the artist. When you're listening to it on Spotify, at least something is going to the artist, but it's not necessarily enough to justify, or it's not much. Like Taylor Swift famously took on Spotify last year because she saw that, by putting her music on Spotify, she wasn't actually going to get much of a return, which is not entirely true, because the amount of music, or the amount of streams that Taylor Swift would get on Spotify versus somebody like, I'll just pick a band I like out of the air. We'll just say Clutch. Clutch is not going to get even a fraction of what Taylor Swift is going to get on Spotify, which means, if Taylor Swift were to put a single on Spotify and it got 1 million listens, she'd make a pretty good bank out of that. Whereas, if Clutch puts a single on Spotify and it gets 100,000 listens, it's not really going to earn them a lot. There's a pretty wide gap. There's a podcast I listen to, and I've mentioned it here, Jamie Josta's podcast, The Josta Show. It's a really good podcast if you're into listening about the business side of, hard rock and metal. And one of the things he talks about often is how Spotify does not pay the artist. And in a way, it's kind of true, because if an artist is on Spotify, Spotify does have to pay them royalty for any time that song is streamed. However, how much money is actually paid for every time a song is streamed? Right around 8/10 of a cent. So not even a penny for every time something is streamed. I get better, return when I use my credit card. I get 1% back anytime on every purchase I get. So that's a penny for every dollar I earn, or for every dollar I spend. Whereas here, you get a stream and they get less than a penny for that stream. So you think about how many streams it takes for them to actually get a significant amount of money. It's going to take a lot. You could have 100,000 streams and walk away with, $800. That's not a lot. That's enough, to, what is that going to cover in terms of what it costs to actually make that song? If you parse out the economics of that song or that album to actually put the dollar value to what Spotify is going to pay them, it's insignificant. It's pennies basically for what it actually costs. And I'll get into Spotify a little bit more here. But people were really mad at Metallica when they brought up this stuff. When Metallica brought it up, they were attacking Napster, who was giving away music for free, basically. Napster was essentially, a pirate site. So they took music, they uploaded it, and people could just go and pick whatever they want. And it was like, great, I never have to pay for music again because I can get everything I want right here. Well, then Metallica sued, and everybody suddenly burned their Metallica CDs, although it was around the same time as Reload, so it's hard to tell whether it was Napster or Reload, either way. But people were pissed. Some people still hold a grudge against Metallica. You can still watch that video on YouTube. It's funny. But there was a point to what they were saying then, and now I think more artists are actually getting it. It's not just exposure. It's not just people listening to music. It's about actually the artist being able to recoup what they lost in order to create that music. And, it's pretty basic business here, is that you spend money, and in order to, stay in business, you have to make equal money or more in return. If you want to grow, you want to make more. But in order to just sustain your business, then you have to get at least the equal amount back. And if you don't, then it's a question, can we sustain? A lot of these bands, they don't break up because they're bitching at each other. They're breaking up because the money just isn't there, and it's like, I can't sustain this. I can't live on this. I have as bands grow older, I have families, I have kids to pay for. I got to do all this stuff. I can't afford to just I can't afford to put so much time and effort into something that doesn't have an immediate return. They actually do need that paycheck. A lot of artists are willing to suffer through that for the art, which is great. But if we don't support them back, then obviously, how long is that going to last? And Jamie Josta talks about this on his podcast a lot, about just artists not getting paid for their work. And it's not just people downloading music illegally. It's also people downloading and streaming music legally. Spotify is a legal service. Pandora these are legal services that you can, sign up for. You can pay money to be a member of, Spotify Premium, Apple Music, whatever. You can listen to this stuff, and they get paid. Well, there is a payment made for the streams. That doesn't mean that the artists themselves will actually get paid for it. And that's another kind of point to this. The whole thing that Metallica really brought to light was that the music industry, there is some there's a lot of conspiracies, maybe would not be the best word, but close enough, to keep artists from being subsisting on their own, which is why you talk about the record industry from, the 70s and 80s and 90s, where, it was just music, they owned so much. We even look at, like, the recent case with Keisha, and it's like, record companies have a stranglehold over artists, and that includes monetary gain. That if, let's say Spotify pays out 0.8 of a cent for each time somebody streams a song. So that song is streamed 1,000,000 times. So somebody makes $8,000 or $80,000, however much that is, because I'm not good at math in my head. Of that money, the studio is going to take their cut, because the studio is probably the one that fronted the money in the first place for this album to be produced. So they're like, well, we got to recoup our losses here, so we're going to take our portion. And so now the studio takes half. So now that $80,000 becomes $40,000. So now it's like, all right, so now this $40,000, you guys are going to have to, divvy up, amongst yourself, amongst, the members of the band. And of course, the band members, they got to pay roadies, they got to pay, for gas, they got to pay for, if they're, on tour, they got to pay, they got to be able to, live on their own. And, by the time you're done with it, they haven't made a dime. They haven't made anything. They haven't profited at all. They've just basically, cashed a paycheck that's going right back out the door. I mean, there were these, it used to be where a record company, they signed somebody to the label. They would, you know, give them a big check. They'd be able to go out, buy some cars, celebrate, buy some drinks, have a good time with it. Problem was, is that's because back then they could count on album sales. But since album sales aren't there anymore, now it's about, okay, so now that everything is streaming, they're not going to be giving away those cushy paychecks just for, signing a deal or for, making an album. It's like, well, now you have to prove that it actually works, on in our current system, um, which is certainly not fair to the artists. And companies like Spotify, they don't make it easy for the artists because basically, like I said, they pay for the number of streams. So if if an artist puts out a song and it gets 10,000 listens, they're not going to be getting much. They're going to be getting, a small check, and if anything, once it gets past the label, if they don't have a good relationship and deal with the label. It's also based on the amount of revenue that they get. So if Spotify has, 10 million subscribers at $10 a pop, so they're basically $100 million a year, on, in or $100 million a month. And there's a million artists or a million unique properties that are out there. They're going to take that revenue, whatever the company doesn't keep, that's the pool that they cut from. And then they cut that up based on how many streams. So if Taylor Swift let's say there's a billion streams and Taylor Swift got 500 million of them, guess who's going to get most of that pot? Taylor Swift. The other 999,999 artists, they are going to have to cut up the rest of it. And chances are they're going to get even less than what, that 0.8 of a cent average per stream. So, and with more people signing up for the premium service, Spotify is making more of a profit, but it's also diluting the pool. So now that there's more people listening to it, there's also more people who are, there's people who are just listening to it constantly. So they're listening to all sorts of different things, and so it's not like, if I just listen to one artist, if I just listen to Deftones all the time, Deftones would probably make a good bank. Problem is I don't listen to Deftones all the time. I also listen to, Fear Factory. I also listen to Pantera. I listen to all these other things. So it spreads that out. It dilutes that pool so that artists get even less than, what they expect. So artists have to do other things, whether it's advertising. That's why you hear so much pop music in advertising, because there's money in advertising, and having a catchy pop song is going to get, artists money. So, Taylor Swift can throw out a pop song there. They can, put it onto a, Dockers commercial or something. Suddenly she's got a check from Dockers. She doesn't have to worry about the money from actually producing the album or making that song, because all of her money comes from advertising. Other artists are not so lucky. I listen to a lot of death metal. Death metal artists don't exactly get into commercials very often, and if they do, it's usually to make fun of them in some way. So they have to rely on other means. Certainly not going to get it from events, because, when you play a show, that in itself is, has cost to it. There's, money that comes from, the ticket money isn't just go into the artist's pockets. It's got to go to pay for all the other things, not to mention renting the event. I mean, there's so much that goes into, the cut from the royalties from a show that, the artists themselves might walk away from a show with $8. So they got to do merchandise, and a lot of bands control their own merchandise, and so that's where a lot of it comes from. Jamie Jost is a big merchandise guy, so he keeps coming up with that. So artists, at least that's one thing that is relatively cheap for them to produce, and they know that they're going to get a good return. But it also explains why, and a lot of people are wondering, why are t-shirts so expensive at concerts anymore? That's why. Because they're not making any money off of the music itself. They have to make money someplace else. Where else are they going to make it? They're not going to make it in ticket sales. They're not going to make it on streaming. They have to make it in merchandise. So if you want a t-shirt, you're going to have to pay $40 for it. That's just the reality of it. Even though it might cost $2 to produce that t-shirt, you're going to be paying $40, because otherwise that band is not going to be around in a year, because they're not going to be able to survive on it. I mean, we all love music. I love music. I listen to music all the time. But it's not going to survive if we don't think about how we consume it. Now, I'm not saying that you can't stream. I'm not saying that, that artists are being greedy. I'm not looking at what Metallica did and saying, they were absolutely right or wrong. But, they certainly brought up a good point that even to this day, we're still discussing it. We're still talking about it because it's something that's worth saying. If we don't give the artists their due, they're not going to be around. So if it's worth it, pay for it. And I'm not trying to sound like a shill for the record labels, but I'm sounding like a shill for the artists because there's a lot of bands I love to listen to who I'd still love to listen to them down the road. And if I don't pay for, to keep them going, I'm not going to be able to listen to them again. So that is my opinion of music. So thanks for watching. You can check out more Paved with Good Intentions right here on YouTube or on iTunes and Stitcher. You can also check out my other videos and anything I've ever favorited. Be sure to check out my other podcast, Translation, which can be found at the link below, as well as on iTunes and Stitcher. And visit me on Twitter at Danny Kestner, or you can find me on Facebook. And if you have any questions you'd like me to ponder on the show, send me an email at translationpodcast@gmail.com. I do want to hear from you. The cake is not a lie. And once again, this podcast is produced sponsor-free, so thank you for supporting independent artists. We'll see you on the other side.